Welcome to the Why Factor, a chance to work out why we do what we do. BBC World Service podcasts are supported by advertising.
Thanks for downloading this edition of the Why Factor, a programme that seeks to find out why we do the things we do. I hope you enjoy it. Are you listening? No. Are you really listening? This is the BBC World Service. Welcome to the Why Factor. I'm Dashiani Navanayagam, and today, why is listening different from hearing? What is the skill of listening, and how can we develop that skill?
From a very young age, we're socialized to be very poor listeners.
We've got one mouth and two ears, therefore we think we can listen.
Well, we're certainly capable of it, but I wouldn't say that most of us do a great job of it.
You know, I'd love to tell you that I'm a perfect listener. It would be a complete lie.
I think before I became a Samaritan, I might have thought myself as a good listener, but it wasn't until I got involved with the Samaritans and trained to be a volunteer that I started to realise what it actually means to be a good listener.
Nadine Barr has been a volunteer for the Samaritans for the past 3 years. It's a UK charity that provides confidential emotional support for people in distress. Her job is to listen to hundreds of stories of people whose lives have reached a state of desperation. Most of them painful, many of them similar. The most difficult calls come on the 6-hour shift, which starts at 3 a.m.
Night shifts are very different to evening shifts, as you can imagine, and callers can call with different problems, and perhaps they haven't been able to sleep or they've woken up really early, and we are the only people they can speak to at that time in the morning, or we're the first person that they pick up the phone to. And yes, we can never truly know exactly what callers might say to us, but it's a thorough exploration of what it is to be a good listener. It seems like a very basic skill, but actually it's quite a complex skill that takes quite a lot of practice and getting used to.
From a very young age, we're socialized to be very poor listeners. There's so many types of barriers that come up that lead us to being poor listeners.
Helen Meldrum is Professor of Psychology at Bentley University in Massachusetts. She's also on the health board of the Global Listening Centre, which promotes the practice of good listening.
There's research that indicates that we can think at speeds of 700 words per minute, but the average American only speaks at about 100 words per minute. So we're often experiencing people speaking to us, and we think they're speaking so slowly that we have time to sort of race around in our mind, have a few irrelevant thoughts, and maybe we'll get back to them later. But of course, that's not how it works out, because we end up distracting ourselves greatly from the message that's incoming through our ears.
There's definitely a technique, and it's made up of various components. So it's about asking open questions, the sort of the what questions and the when, and these questions are quite soft, and rather than ask someone why they did something, it's more about asking them around that question. So it's asking them what they think was the reason for why something happened. It's also asking sort of questions like, can you tell me about how does that feel for you, rather than very direct ones. It's also about summarising what someone is saying to you, to really acknowledge that you are listening to them. It's reflecting using their own language to help clarify a point. And it's about acknowledging what that person's going through as well, and showing that empathy. So it's trying to understand how they feel about the situation rather than how you would feel about the situation. And also Silence as well is actually a key part of listening, which I think might surprise people. And silence gives not just the person talking the time to reflect, it gives the person listening time to reflect.
Some people don't realize the importance or the power of active listening, or maybe they have a false belief that you can simply win a negotiation or a conflict by dominating the conversation. Sometimes we're just impatient. But is it possible? Yeah, there's no secret to it.
Deepak Malhotra, professor at Harvard Business School, is used to high-stakes listening. He's advised on everything from negotiations between large international businesses to conflict resolution between governments and armed insurgents.
When the stakes are high or when it's a complex negotiation, especially when things get heated or emotional, or when both sides feel that they've been wronged, the more of those complexities you add, I think the less people lean on active listening, even though those are the situations where it's most important. You know, it's crucial to empathize. You need to understand where other people are coming from. And ironically, we fail to empathize, especially and exactly in those moments when we need it most, when we're dealing with people who we find to be either aggressive or unethical or irrational or seemingly out to get us.
Hearing is an auditory function, but it's not the same as listening. Listening is an active skill. Listening actually requires attention to something. I'm hearing you is what you often hear between couples. Yes, but are you actually listening?
Arabella Russell is a counsellor with Relate, a UK organisation that helps people with marriage guidance, but now provides counselling for all types of relationships.
We're not very good at listening. We think we are, but because we don't see it as a skill, we don't actually ever really think about it. What does it mean to listen to another person? It's very hard to be told things you don't want to hear. You know, it's much easier to pick holes in somebody and to criticise them for their faults and their weaknesses than to have somebody, particularly somebody who loves you, to sit you down one day and say, I find this hard. And that is difficult.
One of the exercises Relate uses to help couples sort out their differences is something called the speaker-listener technique.
So one person will speak for 4 to 5 minutes and the other will just listen. And that means setting aside all your own thoughts and feelings, not sitting there, you know, waiting for your moment to respond. Because if it's a contentious subject, you might well have got defensive. You might be thinking, well, I didn't say that and she doesn't mean that and that's not true. And the reason it's so important is when your partner has stopped talking, they'll say to you, what have you heard me say? And you will then have to paraphrase back what you've heard. And that often reveals that what's been said is not what we've actually heard. We've listened to something else. And they'll say, no, I didn't mean that, I meant that. And that part of the exercise stops when the person who's talking is happy that the person who's listening has understood. I always say to couples, it feels very artificial at the start to sort of sit there listening and then paraphrasing. You think, oh, God, this is exhausting. I'm not going to do this. But in fact, the resolution is so amazing, which is, oh, I feel understood. Often within our couple relationships, we can get caught up in thinking, well, I want to be agreed with. I mean, that's the most important thing. Actually, in our work, what we find being agreed with becomes less important than somebody taking the trouble to understand you.
Some of the work that I do is looking at negotiations that happen in the world of sports. I look at how team owners and players negotiate collective bargaining agreements, whether it's in the National Football League or National Hockey League here or the National Basketball Association. Now, this is when the owners of the various teams in a league and the players of these same teams meet every few years to negotiate what is essentially a labor management negotiation. And they decide things like salary caps and rules regarding rookie players and trade, etc. And what you often find is when it's time to negotiate these collective bargaining agreements, a lot of value gets destroyed because instead of reaching an agreement and really making the kinds of concessions each side probably should make, they spend a lot of time arguing, going into the media and making their case or going into courts and canceling games instead of actually playing games. The best example of this is probably what happened in the National Hockey League in the United States in 2004-2005. They spent so long talking and not listening to each other that they ended up canceling an entire season. They were arguing over how to split $2 billion, and at the end of it, they destroyed $2 billion in value. And I could make the same sort of case for failed negotiations that have happened when it comes to governments negotiating with armed insurgents, although I would have to say in that case, it's probably not just the only problem. You can see this in strategic partnerships. I advise a lot of companies on strategic partnerships and deals. And often what's dragging the process on too long is people aren't really listening. They're too busy trying to convince the other side about the merits of their own case.
So often affairs aren't about sex. So often the intoxication is about somebody being interested again. Somebody who's like head on one side, connected. Everything you say is funny. Everything you say is, hugely interesting. That becomes the balm in a way. And I think the sadness then comes of actually this is what we used to have. Why don't we have this anymore? Can we get this back? And if that's what they both want, then you can talk about how can you restore this. I'm always very quick to say to couples that it isn't about taking the relationship back to how it was, because how it was is what got you here. It's about creating a new relationship, and good listening skills have to be a very big part of that new relationship. So actually, the importance of listening and the importance of being listened to is key to our emotional well-being.
It's worth thinking about what active listening is really comprised of. And as I understand it, it's sort of two pieces. One is the part where you're actually trying to understand and learn as much as you can about where the other side is coming from. The second part of active listening is not just learning, but showing them that you are learning, showing them that you're trying to understand, and demonstrating to the other side that they're being heard. And when it comes to things like negotiating armed conflicts and ethno-political conflicts or insurgencies, both of these components take on heightened importance. Not only do you need to understand what is and isn't possible, where their interests and constraints are, but often you're dealing with people that for years have been, living in a jungle or living in a ghetto. As a colleague of mine says, these aren't just physical ghettos, these are mental ghettos. Nobody's ever heard them out. Nobody's ever listened. Nobody's ever cared about what their potentially legitimate concerns might be. And so what you're doing with active listening isn't just learning from the point of view of this will help me craft a deal that works for everybody. You're also signaling to them that actually there's somebody who's actually going to listen to them and let them voice their grievances. And that has to be a part of the process as well.
How much can active listening change the outcome of these situations, especially where they're extremely difficult?
It's not going to solve the problem, but I can almost guarantee that the problem will not be solved unless there is some of this. Now, again, in more complex negotiations, again, when we think about conflicts between governments and armed groups, for example, it's not just one person's job to listen actively. In those situations, it takes on sort of a higher level importance. Is the government, is the institution, are the various people involved in this negotiation all actually taking in the information that's being given to them and acting on it? See, when it's a one-on-one conversation, it's easy to define what active listening looks like. You can test, did you understand it? And did you signal to them that you understood it? Great. But when you're dealing with institutions, when you're dealing with groups of people, when you're dealing with societal concerns, active listening is a lot harder to pin down. Because what does it mean for the government to understand something? Well, part of it is based on whether or not they enact that understanding in the strategy they take, in the public pronouncements, in the legislation they try to pass. And there it becomes more and more complicated. So again, it comes down to it's a necessary condition, but it's not a sufficient condition. You still need a lot of other things to solve these problems as well.
Our understanding of good listening is clouded by muddled thinking, says Nadine Barr, Samaritans volunteer.
I think we are at large a society based on advice giving and solution finding and drawing conclusions on every situation. And so sometimes people might not quite recognise that you can help someone by allowing them to talk, by really truly listening to them and giving them that time. And often people mix up sympathy and empathy. So people think that they are showing empathy, but really what they're doing is they're showing sympathy. The problem or the situation that's presented to them, they approach it through the way they would deal with it or from their perspective. And actually, to show empathy, it's actually about seeing it from and understanding it from the other person's perspective.
our growing attachment to screens isn't helping. You've got the telly, you've got the screen, you've got the pad, you're not listening. That other person doesn't feel attended to. I think we get this idea that we're constantly connected to others. So we're chatting, we're sending texts, we're doing this, there's Instagram, there's Snapchat, there's Facebook. So, we are in touch with everybody. But research shows that actually eye-to-eye contact is particularly important. But also this illusion that we're in contact shuts us down on the listening front, I think, because it's like, well, no, I'm hearing these people, I'm reading about them, I'm learning about them, I'm in touch with them. That must mean we're connected. And I think that skill is becoming increasingly dulled.
I think the more experienced people are, the more receptive they are. I think when you talk to a student who hasn't been out in the real world very long, hasn't dealt with very difficult negotiations, hasn't dealt with very, very serious conflict, for them, it sounds a little bit theoretical. Yeah, it sounds good in theory, but I'm sure it's not that big of a deal. But people that have been out there, that have been hurt by not doing it, that have lost big deals or destroyed a lot of value or have found, not just professionally, but personally, the consequences of not being a good listener, for them, it's very, very self-evident the moment you start talking about it, and then they just want to know more about it.
It is hard to listen to things you don't want to hear. And sometimes I really have to kind of focus and think, no, I shall listen to this. And I need to listen to this, and it's not easy. I'd love to tell you that I'm a perfect listener. It would be a complete lie, because I know what I should be doing, but I don't always do it. I think we should teach our children how to do it, because in so many couple relationships, communication, 80% of people who come to relate come with communication problems, and then just below that they come because of conflicts and arguments. Now actually that's all about poor communication, and communication's about talking and about listening, but sometimes the listening bit of communication gets forgotten.
Thanks for listening to The Y Factor. I'm Dashiani Navanayagam. If you enjoyed this edition, you may be interested in others, such as our examination of smiling or our programme on torture. You'll find those and many more on the website, and we'd love to hear your views on the programme and your ideas for future topics. You can reach us at yfactor@bbc.com.